Your camera has to be told what color looks like, and it does that by the color white. White balance is all about how your camera interprets color. There is a very, very deep and very, very mathematical explanation for this, but I'm not going to give you that because you're a beginner and I'm not trying to weigh you down with a ton of over-complicated mathematics and information. I'm just going to give you the short and the sweet. Your camera interprets light and color in a very specific fashion. It's different for each model and each brand of camera, but they all function on the same rough set of rules. When your camera looks at a scene, it determines white is this color in this kind of light. So here, let me give you an example. White is this color in this kind of light. When the light changes, the color of that white or the temperature of that white changes. The manufacturer understands this and knows that you will be shooting in multiple different kinds of light throughout your career or your time with this camera. So what they have done is they have created white balance modes to give you the ability to cycle the way your camera looks at light and color. Here's how this works. If you're shooting in daylight, white looks different. And since your camera bases all colors off of how it sees white, then your colors are going to look different in daylight than they will in the shade. So your eye and your brain has the ability to interpret colors regardless of the lighting. For example, red is always red, and you will always see red in bright daylight, in shade, in tungsten lights, in fluorescent lights, in LED lights. The color of red stays the same. And the way that your brain interprets that color is by looking at the light and saying, okay, well, I know that that's that color. Your camera's not so smart. Your camera has to be told what color looks like, and it does that by the color white, or the absence of color. When you're in bright daylight, white to your camera looks different than it does when you're in the shade. So the manufacturer of your camera set up these settings in order to make your camera somewhat smart and give it the ability to interpret color based off of that. Here's an example. Right now, I'm shooting this video in a flash mode, right? So the white balance is set to flash for me. Well, that's because I've got these LED lights, and the flash mode is the only setting, in my opinion, that looks really good with these lights. But what happens if I change my mode? Here, let me show you. So if I change my setting to sunlight, you'll see that it's a little bit more blue. That's because the camera is interpreting the light that is in the scene as direct, harsh sunlight. It is trying to compensate. So it's throwing this bluish tint on here to make it feel more like bright sunlight. But what happens if we change it again? So if I change my white balance setting to shade, the camera assumes that I'm shooting in the shade, and therefore it tries to warm things up a little bit. You'll notice how the image got a little bit warmer. That's because in the shade, white has more of a blue tint, and your camera is trying to compensate for that. So it says, yeah, this is probably the right setting for this kind of light, and this is how I'm going to interpret white. Let's change it again. So we swapped it over to tungsten, and you'll notice that this image is a lot bluer. That's because tungsten lights generally tend to be really warm, and they give everything a bit of a yellow/orange tint. Well, I'm not shooting in tungsten lights, I'm shooting in LED lights. And because I'm shooting with LED lights, everything looks blue because I'm getting generally a pure white out of my LED lights. But the camera thinks that I'm shooting in tungsten, so it throws this blue tint on to compensate against the orange. Once again, it is seeing this white now has a blue tint to it. Do you see that? There's blue in the white, which makes the rest of the image blue. Let's change it one more time. Okay, this time we put the settings on fluorescent. So the camera thinks that I'm shooting in fluorescent light. Once again, LED lights, but it says, oh, well, if he's shooting in fluorescent lights, we know that fluorescent lights tend to have a bit more green to them. So what we'll do is we'll compensate by adding more purple into the image. You'll notice that while it does look blue at first glance, I'm a lot more purple in my skin tones. My skin on the back of my hand is a lot more purple, and this white is a lot more purple. You see over here in the shadows how it's got this purple tint to it. That is because fluorescent lights give off green light. They make everything else look greener. That is why the manufacturer said, well, we're gonna put more purple on this light to compensate. So let's go back to normal. Once again, I have set my camera back to the flash mode. The flash mode interprets light the best for my particular setting. When you're out shooting photos, you have a number of different options. When you cycle through your white balance, you can set up auto white balance, which means you allow the camera to interpret the scene on its own and you just take the picture. If you are shooting in bright sunlight, you can set your camera's white balance to sunlight, and it will interpret the light the best for that situation. You can also set it for shade if you are in the shade. You can set it for cloudy if you are in cloudy, overcast conditions. Setting that white balance means that you are in greater control of your image. Now, if you are like me and you do a lot of black and white photography, you can pick and choose which light setting you want, because then you're not talking about color, you're just interpreting light. But even then, your camera's still interpreting color and transforming it into black and white. Understanding the white balance mode is really important. The white balance mode allows you to compensate the color that the camera sees for different kind of lighting situations. Once again, I suggest you take your camera out in dark settings, shade settings, sunlight settings, and you flip through these to understand how your camera handles color and how your camera's white balance settings make your image look different. Very important that you get a grip on this. This is a really important part of exposing your image properly. It's also an important part of getting the right colors to show up in your final product.